This is the Sony A7IV and this is the Nikon Z6III. Let's compare the Nikon Z6III with Sony's A7S4. These two cameras really compete with each other. They're similarly priced. They have slight differences in actual sensor spec in terms of resolution, but overall they're very well matched. Welcome to Frame Stream. Subscribe to the channel. If you think you know what to expect from this comparison, then you're probably mistaken. There is so much to cover and there are so many twists and turns every now and then that in the end it became fun for me and I really started to enjoy making this video. I would like to start with video quality first, and then photo quality, and then autofocus performance, and so on. Let's start with video quality. The Sony A7IV is a really good camera, gives you very sharp 7K downsampled 4K. The S-Log3 in XAVC-SI codec has a bitrate of up to 600 Mbps, which is really high for this category of cameras. It can do 1080 120p and can also do 4K 60p, but with 1.5 times crop. It's full frame at 4K 30. Overall, the quality of the image from the Sony is so good that you will be shocked. Honestly, it is beautiful. Theoretically, in video, the Sony A7S4 4K 24 has dynamic range higher than A7S III even. You can see just how smooth the look is in the shadows or on her green. But there's a catch, which I'll talk about in a bit later on. Even when I further underexposed the image by about 2 stops in the shadows, which is already underexposed, you can see how well the image holds up. So good. You can actually focus on protecting the highlights with this camera when you need to, because it's so easy to recover shadow details with a high quality rendering. In comparison, the H.265 10-bit 420 image from Nikon from the Z6III doesn't look as good initially, especially underexposed further. The Z6III 10-bit 420 image looks like it's about to fall apart. Side by side, to my eyes here, the A7IV looks smoother, deeper, nicer with less noise. Not only when it is almost perfectly exposed for high dynamic range scene like this one, but also when it's not so favorably exposed for the shadows. But notice something strange here. If you zoom in into the Z6III image, you will notice that the green color is more authentic and truer to life. On the other hand, the A7S4 seems to be a much smoother image. The green doesn't seem to have chroma noise, but it shows a slight magenta shift. What I feel is happening here is that the Sony applies chroma noise reduction to the shadows and does it quite effectively. It increases the dynamic range quite dramatically, but also shows up a little bit of color shift, which might occur when you are trying to reduce color noise in camera or in post. Theoretically, doing that should work against the advantage of having 4:2 color depth, but possibly Sony can do it because it is 4:2, unlike 4:0 on the Nikon. Now, if you do a little bit of noise reduction on the Z6III 10-bit H.265 420 file, you will start to see much nicer image. Now, here's the thing. With the Nikon, you can also shoot in ProRes HQ 10-bit 420, which will give you an exceptionally beautiful image with very good playback on most computers and with most editors. But at that point, at that file size, because the ProRes 10-bit files can be really large, given the large file size of ProRes, shooting 4K 24 in high quality grade 12-bit NRAW is possible. It's almost the same size, and that will actually give you even smaller file sizes, because contrary to what you may believe, what you may think, the Z6's high quality grade 12-bit NRAW for 4K 24 has a bitrate of 660 Mbps and normal quality grade has a bitrate of 340 Mbps. That is manageable because Nikon will record a proxy file as well. Now you can just pull in the proxy file and edit the timeline on the proxy file. Just color grade, during color grade, just switch to your NRAW image. When you apply a slight bit of noise reduction on the Nikon NRAW, the image output is stunning. Let's talk about photos. It's simple. The Sony A7IV gives you high resolution 33 megapixel files, better performance in better performance in highlights and better ISO performance. I think high ISO tests matters between 3200 and 6400, because anything below 3200 doesn't show much difference, and anything above 6400 needs more light or wider aperture or better managed scene. Now, about the Z6III's 24 megapixel sensor, yes, it's good enough for most situations. But for those who say 24 megapixels is good enough, I want them to understand why some want 33 megapixels. Please be open to this perspective. What 6K is to 4K editing process, 33 megapixels is to 24 megapixel editing output process. What 6K is for 4K timeline output process, that's what 33 megapixels is for 24 megapixel editing cropping output process. That's what I think. And that's where I don't see 24 being fantastic and 33 being too much. I look at it as 33 is great for a better 24 megapixel editing output process and all that. The Nikon can do 14 FPS in mechanical shutter and 20 FPS in electronic shutter, but with full 12-bit RAW. Basically, if you want proper 14-bit RAW and higher than 12 frames per second, the Nikon gives you that balance. Could Nikon have done 40 FPS or more in 12-bit RAW? Oh yes, theoretically they could have, because it can already do 60 FPS in 6K full frame video. So I think it can do 12-bit RAW in almost 20 megapixels 12-bit files. I think it seems possible theoretically, but for whatever reason Nikon decided to not open that up. Sony can only do 6 frames a second if you want full 14-bit RAW files. You can shoot 10 frames a second with the Sony, but you will only get 12-bit RAW files, which is still usable in some scenarios, but well, it's not as good at 14-bit. Autofocus is important. They both are very good, but I think the Nikon is slightly ahead now. I like how the Sony gradually focus shifts always in video, but I've seen the A7IV lose focus enough times on the 70 millimeters, 70 to 200, 2.8 GM version 2, that it tells me that at times Nikon is slightly more consistent. The transition is better on the Sony, because I've seen Nikon jitter to acquire focus. It kind of finds focus, goes back and forth slightly, ever so slightly, before it settles on that focus point in video. I think that could be a little awkward in some situations. So you have to just look out for that. The transition on the Sony is beautiful, but it's more, the Z6III picks up the subject and stays on it more consistently than the Sony, even with their top-of-line 2.8 lenses. When zooming in and out with the 70 to 200 on both bodies, the Sony would often lose focus both in video and photos. Like I'm shooting and the zooming in and out. When the zooming in and zooming out is happening, I often lose a few shots on the Sony. I have not seen that happen with the Nikon. That's surprising. I don't know whether that's the Nikon Z70 to 200 2.8 or it's the camera. Let me know what you think and whether you have seen that in your Nikon or Sony cameras, because that's a very interesting thing for me, and I think that's a very real world use case. You just want to zoom out if something is coming towards you. Now, we all know the Sony A7IV has a slow sensor, but let me show you just how slow it is in comparison with the Z6III. The rolling shutter speed put the Z6III in a different category altogether. Just this alone puts the Z6III in a different category. Same for the IBIS. We all know that Sony cameras do not have the best IBIS in the world, but what they do with active state is still good, quite good. Here, let me show you how they perform side by side. I could get a sharp image shooting at 1/10 of a second at 200 millimeters with the Nikon Z6III. I tried that and I was successful. I found the same result even with the Canon R6 II. Yes, 1/10 of a second at 200 millimeters, I could read the texts easily. But the Sony failed to do that. The best I could do is 1/60th of a second. Potentially, if you have steadier hands, maybe you can pull off a 1/50th of a second. But I think typically you can't go below that for stills. If you want the detail to be preserved and you want to use a long lens and you want to ensure that you get all details in focus, I think it'll be difficult for you to go below 50th of a second on the A7 IV. So overall, these two cameras are fantastic. I think they are amazing cameras. They are still competent competitors to each other. My conclusion is that if you want a camera that does photo better with high resolution, more megapixels, and that's your primary use case, you want cheap third party and even used Sony lenses, you want, for example, a very good video in mostly static scenarios, or even if there is movement, there's not too much movement, and you mostly shoot with 4K 24, go for the Sony. However, if you want a camera for the same cost, same price, if you want a camera that can do a lot more, it can do, for example, 4K 120, yes, with the DX crop, but it can do almost full frame 1080 120, 1080 240 in 10-bit, that too. You want a camera that does not have any rolling shutter, almost minimal, as good as the A7S III. You want a camera that can still give you 24 megapixels and very good IBIS, very good weather sealing, as good, and very good sturdy build quality. If you like the optical perfection of the Nikon lenses, especially when you're shooting photos, there are many Sony lenses, especially the G versions, not the GM ones. Even at times the GM ones suffer from this. You will see that there's a tremendous amount of vignetting and distortion beyond the middle 40% of the image, or the middle 50% of the image. What happens is that you're eating up the dynamic range on the sides, and the image may start to look more noisy on the sides because you're stretching it, you're pulling it, you're pushing exposure higher there just to counterbalance the vignetting on those GM lenses, or on those G lenses especially. But if you actually want a more well-rounded camera, where the system ensures that the lenses are actually very good because how the mount is designed. It's a wide mount, it's a large projection area onto the sensor, so you have less, let's say, complications and compromises on the optical output from the lenses onto the sensor. If you want third-party access, and if you even want to use, for example, your existing Sony lenses and you want to use them for some time during your transition period on the Nikon bodies, you can go for the Nikon. Because you know what? The NRAW, if you're able to actually shoot in NRAW normal quality, you get actually a smaller file with 12-bit RAW in video than what you get on the Sony. Almost slightly smaller at times. And the more important thing is that now, especially if you want to do a little bit of noise correction in post in DaVinci or other softwares, then the color accuracy and the output that you'll get from the NRAW will not be matched. But I think you'll still benefit from the NRAW. If you start working with proxy files, this camera will record a separate proxy file so that you can manage it better on your timeline. So all these things well-rounded, I think the Z6III is actually winner. And the only caveat in this is that it probably has half a stop lower dynamic range at its base ISO. Do I think that the half a stop dynamic range is not important enough? I think even a 1/3 stop dynamic range is very important, because when you push the file to its limit, what can save the image from getting ruined is probably that last 1/3 of a stop, is probably that last half a stop. So every stop of dynamic range matters. When you talk about 2/3, that's like 66% of the way to making the image double as good. So it is important. Every bit of dynamic range is important. How I would actually interpret this is to say that, look, if you want a better, well-rounded camera, and if you know how to manage the scene, how to use lighting better, then that 2/3 of a stop will not matter. What will matter, in fact, is if the autofocus is faster, if you can shoot more, if you're being able to shoot at higher speeds, with full 14-bit and not with 12-bit RAW. That's going to matter there, because when you're shooting at 10 frames a second, for all that dynamic range on the Sony camera and the Sony files, the A7IV files, you're not getting 14-bit, you're getting only 12-bit. So it's a complex decision, but I think I know who needs was. If you're a still life shooter, A7S3. If you move around a bit more, you have to run around, you visit places, Z6III. If you want something that's more future-proof, Z6III. If you want something that comes close to the A7S3, Z6III. Yeah, I'm going to see you soon with another one. Subscribe.